That explains it.
All right, we'll bring the committee back to order, and we have up House File 3612, Representative Fenton. Representative Fenton, I will move House File 3612 be recommended to be re-referred to the Committee on Ways and Means. Representative Fenton, to your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. So House File 3612 is basically requires the Commissioner of Health and Human Services and the Commissioner of Feed to review the unemployment data for all the regions in our state and make a report for the SNAP waivers. Because if there are not enough, if the unemployment is high, there are not enough jobs, therefore those on receiving SNAP will be exempt from the work requirements for it. And it's just good common sense to have both the departments of Deed and Human Services talking about the unemployment rate. And this is also compliance with the federal level.
All right. And no amendments to your bill and any testifiers.
Not today, thank you.
All right. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to testify to the bill or signed up? We have? Okay. We have Jessica Webster. Welcome to the committee. Please introduce yourself to the record and proceed with your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, my name is Jessica Webster. I'm a staff attorney with Legal Aid. I am familiar with both state and federal SNAP law. I also serve as the co-chair of the SNAP ABOD task force, the SNAP able-bodied adult without dependents task force. That task force also has counties, providers, and some other advocates that have been looking at the work requirement for single adults accessing SNAP. Members, I have both some technical and substantive concerns with this legislation. My technical concerns about this bill are that the bill goes beyond just federal compliance. Section 1A does appear to mirror federal compliance and federal law. Section 1B seems to introduce a new concept and a new layer of complexity for ABOD waivers. And it's really this 1.18 and this concept of whether or not a work requirement is untenable. That's not something that I find in federal law. So it gives me pause, and I have concerns that this law or that this proposal might be seeking to expand work requirements for single adults in SNAP. And the reason that gives me pause and gives me some heartache is that I have familiarity with what has happened to single adults accessing SNAP that have fallen under the work requirement. For those of you who don't know, we do have a work requirement for single adults accessing SNAP. It was restored in 2013. It's a federal requirement. It's an 80-hour-a-month requirement for single adults. What has happened in Minnesota is really a tragedy. Since between 2013, actually, it was implemented November of 2013. If you look at the 1 year following that implemented work requirement, 47,000 adults lost access to food. The unduplicated count since 2013 is 67,000 Minnesotans who have lost food. The reason that this is so troubling and is so sad is that this work requirement has so many compassionate exemptions in it. So the work requirement in SNAP has exemptions for disability and illness, and it has a number of exemptions that are really important to a vulnerable single adult population. A lot of the single adults who are poor and are in this population suffer from disability, injury, illness, literacy challenges, addiction, homelessness, PTSD from military service, and a lack of reliable transportation. Counties were just never equipped and never funded to ensure that these exemptions were applied and that the work requirement only applied to able-bodied adults. So today, there are only 6,000 Minnesotans remaining that are attached to SNAP under the work requirement, and that's after 67,000 Minnesotans have lost access to food. I'll just leave it, I'm happy to be a resource on SNAP going forward and on the ABOD work requirement, but I'd really encourage you to talk to your counties about what their experience has been with the ABOD work requirement. I think they would describe that it has truly been an administrative nightmare, and they are doing their best to try to implement something that is very, very challenging. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Webster. Welcome to the committee. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed.
Good evening. My name is Colleen Moriarty, and I'm the Executive Director of Hunger Solutions Minnesota. I'm here tonight on behalf of the charity system and its response to people who lose their access to food. I, too, served on the ABOD committee for almost 2 years and looked at the practical way in which this could be implemented in the state. We were dealing with county workers who had never heard of an ABOD exemption, who needed training, who needed to know how it was we were going to serve these people. Once people have lost their access to food, they are dependent on the emergency food system. All of you have food shelves in your local communities. For every meal that is served by a food shelf, SNAP serves 12 meals in our state. We have over 600,000 people who are currently using the SNAP program. In times of unemployment, in times of serious economic challenge, or in times where the economy has recovered unevenly in our state, those people turn to the emergency food system. The resources are just not there to serve them. People in food shelves are working as hard as they can to be able to meet the needs of for emergency food when people come to the door, offer them the most nutritious food that they can. I believe that the 6,000 people who currently are slated to lose their access to food will also turn. And if they're in your county, you're going to hear from your food shelves, and the people who need assistance are not going to be able to find it. We're concerned that this legislation has the potential to expand the harsh consequences of an already poorly designed policy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Moriarty. All right. Representative Liebling.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is this the time you wanted to take questions of these witnesses, or?
There's one more that had signed up, Mr. Nate Kruger. Is he
I
here?
could wait.
Okay. I don't see Mr. Kruger here, so I think now would be a great time.
Okay.
Representative Liebling.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the testifiers for coming in this evening to talk about this really important topic. I've been doing some quick calculations here, and I just wanted to ask you, when we talk about people working and then instead of getting SNAP, instead of getting food assistance, I think we have to think about what people are able to earn right now and how far it goes. And so I was doing some quick calculations. I think that the minimum wage right now is $7.50 an hour if you work for a small company, $9.65, I think, if you work for a larger company. And so even if we take that larger number and you calculate it out, I'm getting that a person who worked 40 hours a week at that level would earn just over $20,000 a year. And I know that the Minnesota, I think DEED, does some calculations about what you need to earn in order to have a living wage, just a basic needs budget. And I recall that in the metro area, at least for a family, they do a calculation kind of for a typical family and 2 parents and childcare and all these different expenses they calculate out, that you need about, if I'm remembering right, over $19 an hour to have a basic needs budget in the metro area. And yet our minimum wage is $9.65 if you're working for a large company. And we know that many people do earn more than that, but that is our minimum wage. So I guess my question is, maybe I'm looking more for a comment on that, because even if every single person was working 40 hours a week, it's my understanding that because the cost of living has so outpaced wages, that there would still be hunger. Is that your understanding? Or could you address that?
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Representative Liebing, that absolutely is true. What we have found is that it's important not to lose sight of the fact that what we're talking about here is a person's access to food. Their ability to be able to support themselves on a low-wage job is a definite challenge. And because of that challenge, people move on and off the SNAP rolls at times. I think that given the unemployment rate in some of these counties, for instance, in Aiken, Minnesota, where they immediately qualified to be an exempt county because of the unemployment, even with the best recommendations from our Department of Human Services and DEED, there still aren't the jobs there for people to have. And they certainly not the jobs that they can support themselves with. And so I believe that the access to food is an important element to their success. Whether looking for employment or maintaining their employment, it's important that a person is granted enough nutrition to keep them healthy and to keep them able to look for self-sufficiency and employment.
Thank you.
Representative Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And maybe to Ms. Webster or to the testifiers or to the author of the bill, I am just looking at the lines that Ms. Webster called out, and in particular, line 1.18, and what this condition is setting up here. And what that standard is, that we would be asking the Department of Employment and Economic Development to state. I'm wondering if Ms. Webster, because you mentioned it in your testimony, if you could expound a little bit on your understanding of what that means. I'm not an expert in the federal code, and what the implications for that would be.
Mr. Chair, Representative Murphy, I brought a handout. I apologize for not handing it out, but I did bring the Code of Federal Regulations Title VII, which is referenced here, if I could pass that out.
One of the pages will come by and grab that for you, Ms. Webster.
So, Mr. Chair, Representative Murphy, the federal waiver law is rather simple. They look at areas with 10% or higher unemployment, or places that don't have a sufficient number of jobs to provide employment. Now, when I look at this proposal, Section A closely mirrors and actually cites CFR Title VII, 273.24, paragraph F, which is what the federal law is. The new introduction here is in B. And what this tells me is that the commissioner, before applying for a waiver, if you're in a county, for instance, with 20% or 15% unemployment, before HHS, DHS could apply for a waiver, they would go to DEED and say they wanted to apply for a waiver, and then DEED would have this added layer of approval of whether or not this is a county where we should have a work requirement. And that really goes beyond what the federal law has set up. The federal law has set up high unemployment rate counties are not counties where we should be requiring vulnerable single adults to have a mandatory 80-hour-a-month work requirement right now. Once unemployment falls in that county and the economy recovers or there are more jobs available, that might be the appropriate time to have a work requirement in that county. But we shouldn't have high unemployment rate counties with this work requirement. Does that make sense?
And Mr.
Representative
Chair,
Murphy.
and Ms. Webster, that is helpful to me. And I thank you for the handout, and of course, haven't been able to read it. What I am not clear about is if the Department of Human Services has to go to the Department on Employment and Economic DEED, I'll just say DEED. If DHS has to go to DEED and ask for this, is there a standard by which DEED is supposed to make that determination?
Ms. Webster.
Mr. Chair, members, the federal law does set out a number of standards and a number of statistics that can be used and a number of data sources that can be used. But what this proposal does at 1.18 is it crafts an entirely new standard, this untenable standard that none of us really know what that means. I have not gotten clarity from DHS on what that means. I don't know that DEED knows what that means, and it's undefined here. So to me, it complicates things, and it adds a new layer of discretion on whether or not a county might have a work requirement.
Then, Mr. Chair and Representative Fenton, I'm wondering if you could maybe share a little bit about at least the origination of this, or you're thinking about this. It doesn't make sense to me, at least in the thinking about it. Like, I don't know that we want to give a state agency such wide discretion to make a determination without criteria. So I don't know if you can expound on that for me a little bit.
So, thank you, Representative Murphy. The goal here is really to comply and have a full understanding, because if the unemployment rate is very high, then many of these people don't have to abide by the work requirement. And that's really what I'm trying to get at, is compliance in what is required of them. And that's my goal with this as a whole. It is going on to another committee, so I'm open to working with people if they don't understand it. But, currently, right now, because the unemployment is high and there are lack of jobs in the areas, for fiscal year 2018, there are 29 counties that are exempt from SNAP waivers. There are 12 Indian reservations that are exempt from the work requirement, I should say. So that's really what this is about compliance, because I don't want to open the state up to having a lot more people lose their SNAP benefits because we're not complying with federal government. And that's my overall goal.
And thank you, Mr. Chair, and Representative Fenton. I hear your goal, and I appreciate that. And I'm just trying to reconcile that with Ms. Webster's testimony suggesting that the language in the Section B is unclear and could serve to create some sort of layer of bureaucracy and discretion on the part of an agency that is maybe not your intention and certainly unclear at this point. And so I would suggest that you consider maybe striking that section of the proposal if it's not adding to the compliance that you're trying to define in the legislation.
Representative Murphy, thank you, Mr. Chair. I am happy to work with the concerns as this moves on to the next committee.
Representative Gruenhagen.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the testifiers, and thank you, Representative Fenton, for bringing this bill forward. You answered some of my question about compliance already. You kind of addressed that. And, we got 29 counties, like you mentioned, that aren't in compliance. My counties that I represent are not in there. So I guess, the question I would have is, if we're not in compliance, you referenced the idea that we could lose our SNAP benefits. And could you just elaborate on that a little bit more?
Representative Fenton.
Thank you. My concern is absolutely that we lose the program altogether because the state is not complying with federal law.
Representative Gruenhagen.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, then I have a question for the testifiers. Ms. Webster probably could respond. I think in your testimony you said that, first off, what would you say to that? If we're not in compliance, we might lose the SNAP program or a substantial part of it altogether?
Ms. Webster.
Mr. Chair, Representative Gruenhagen, we are absolutely following federal law. We are following federal law so tightly that we have kicked 67,000 Minnesotans off the program by following the letter of the law. So there's no question that we're not in compliance. Minnesota was one of the first states to come back into a work requirement effect after the recession. And so I think everyone's looking at Minnesota and what's happening here, and we are in compliance. There's never been a question that we're not in compliance. And Representative Gruenhagen, the question is not whether, what this language does is it could introduce a work requirement to more counties at a lower standard. So whereas the federal government says you have to have a work requirement in counties that have lower than 10% unemployment, this language could possibly open up a county that has more than 30% unemployment to a work requirement. And so it does provide some discretion that's not required by federal law, and it provides this new kind of complexity. And Representative Gruenhagen, I do have the list of counties, I'm sorry I didn't give this to the page either, that shows the number of Minnesotans that have lost food by county just in that first year following the work requirement. But this isn't just an urban-suburban issue. This has touched every part of the state and has touched most counties. And so most of you do have people who have lost access to SNAP under this work requirement.
Representative Gruenhagen.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so Representative Fenton, she seems to imply that you're going to even lower the standard lower than the federal requirements. Is that your intent with this bill?
That is not my intent, and I'm willing to work with them as this moves on to another committee.
One more question.
All right, wrap up, Mr. Gruenhagen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right.
One more question for the Ms. Webster. I think you indicated 67,000. You just said it again. Well, I'm sure some of those people are in my county, okay, of the 67,000, probably a couple thousand, I don't know. But in the almost 50 counties that are under the federal requirement, I just don't see people starving to death. They are getting food. I mean, anywhere I've gone in the state, whether metro or rural, and I do travel around a lot, these 67,000 aren't, laying out on the street starving to death. I mean, we have a very vibrant food shelf. I donate to it, okay? And I think the private sector and the charitable sector are stepping up where needed to fill that need.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Representative Gruenhagen, there are 3 million visits to food shelves in the state, one every 8 minutes. There is enormous need in the state, and hunger, because of Minnesota being a prideful place with a prideful population, people are not starving on the street, but that is not an indication of whether or not they're skipping meals so their children can eat or they know where their next meal is coming from. I'm sure that is not your intention to ever wish that upon anyone in your community or anywhere else. Simply said, the private sector and the charitable sector cannot provide the kind of assistance that these large numbers of people seeking food assistance, regardless of your generous contributions. Those are only 5% of what feeds the 3 million people who visit food shelves. Most of the funding for that comes from the federal government.
Mr. Chair, one brief response, and no question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gruenhagen, then we have Loeffler, Schultz, Pinto, and
Okay.
Stein.
I guess you made my point. Having served on the school board and other public facilities, we have great businesses, great individuals. I've seen them step up to meet that need. And we have a generous state in Minnesota. And I think their money can do it more effectively and efficiently than what a government program does.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I disagree.
Ms. Moriarty, we're going to go to Representative Loeffler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I always believe we should know what we're passing and who's really affected and what the measures are. And the Code of Federal Regulations, thank you, Ms. Webster, for handing that out, refers to areas. There's been a lot of discussion about counties. The bill before us refers to regions. Indeed tends to react to regions in which the metro is one big blob. Over half of the state's population is in one region. And if that's true, that we're going to deed regions, I suspect no one in the metro area would ever make an exception, even though we have areas of really high unemployment. It's disproportionately high unemployment in areas like North Minneapolis and inner city South Minneapolis, where there has been major disinvestment by employers and people are transit dependent. Their ability to get to employment out in the exurbs is really limited. And yet, if you even just averaged it across across Hennepin County, 23% of the state's population lives in Hennepin. And so those areas of high concentrated unemployment will never show up, even if we use a county measure. But I'd really like Representative Fenton to clarify, is it your intent to go with the deed regions? Is it your intent to go with counties? Could we go with zip codes? What is the federal expectation in defining an area? Because the Fed regulation is area, so it seems like we have some discretion.
The bill deals with regions, and many of the counties that are listed actually are in a certain region, being in rural Minnesota. But the bill, as federal law states, deals with regions.
Representative Locke.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm definitely going to have to oppose this bill on that basis, because there's no reason that you should put half the state's population in one region and expect them to they'd never make the threshold, I suspect, where we have counties that, no offense to small counties, but we have counties with less than 10,000 people. And we have regions probably that have less than 30,000. And that's fine, but it doesn't give the equal access to the same kind of consideration if you're in a high unemployment zone in the metropolitan area. And if this goes beyond the federal expectations, I think we need to really rethink this, because it's really unfair to people in the half of the state that live in the metro area, that they're put into one region that takes in all 7 counties, if not the statistical metro area. I don't work in economic development, so I'm not sure, but I'm sure it's at least the 7 counties.
Representative Fenton.
The federal law does allow for county or region, so they do allow it some flexibility there.
Well, Mr. Chair?
Representative Locke.
Well, thank you, Representative Fenton. I didn't see that in the Code of Regulations, but I think your bill needs to be changed to target it to a reasonable size population, because it shouldn't be unequal access and unequal treatment depending upon what particular part of the state you happen to live in, whether you're in a population sparse area or in a really dense metropolitan area. We should be treating all potential recipients the same, and we should use a similar standard on unemployment. And your bill right now refers to regions, and so I'm afraid that it will take the 7-county metro and really unfairly punish people who are in the high unemployment zones of the metropolitan area.
Representative Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to Representative Loeffler's point, in St. Louis County, 2,400 individuals were kicked off their SNAP benefits. In Hennepin County, over 16,000, and Ramsey County, over 8,600. So this is, I'm really shocked that 67,000 individuals lost their SNAP benefits. And I don't remember this being a big story in 2014, 2015. So I'm glad you're bringing this to us tonight, and that we can talk about this. This is a big problem, and this is why we have so much food insecurity today, because they don't have these benefits. My concern with the bill is that federal law takes precedence over state statute. And so my concern is that if this becomes law, are we going to be subject to very expensive litigation and have to field that expense?
Representative Fenton.
The SNAP benefits are completely, it's 100% federal funding.
Representative Schultz.
So I can't answer about.
I guess, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my question was that if DEED makes a decision that violates federal law, maybe one of the testifiers can answer this, are we going to be subject to litigation?
Well, I can answer that just from our precedent, Representative Schultz. We could be sued for any reason, for any number of reasons. It's the Attorney General's job to represent the state with litigation as a result of any laws that we do pass as a legislature, and that is not something that we carry on our fiscal notes within our jurisdictions, but it is something that could be a cost that the state does may or may not have to do with any legislation that we pass.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Our-
I'm just worried that this would make it more likely.
Representative Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to that point, while it's true we could be sued any time, some lawsuits will be better founded than others. And I guess maybe, I'm just curious if Ms. Webster can comment on the strength of a lawsuit where the state is attempting to preempt federal law regarding this.
Ms. Webster.
Mr. Chair, Representative Pinto, we have some legal aid attorneys in our office who are very concerned about this language and have said that it's absolutely challengeable. I can't talk about whether, what the merits of those cases would be and the expense and whatnot, but we're concerned that this is taking state law far afield from where federal law is.
Mr. Chair, thank you. There's been a lot of talk about compliance and the likelihood of the state being found out of compliance. I wonder, could we have, I don't know if somebody from DHS is here, maybe Ms. Sommerfeld perhaps, and could just comment on, if that'd be okay, on the bill and kind of that process.
Welcome to the committee. Please introduce yourself for the record and proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jennifer Sommerfeld. I'm the Legislative Director for Children and Family Services. Yes, the state is in compliance with federal law. We file waiver applications every year. I think our next application period is September 30th, and we operate under one of the three federal requirements. So we look at designation of areas that are, and I'm going to have to dig it out again here, they are 20% above the national average for a 24-month period. So there are different options that states can use for their applications, and that is the one that we use.
Okay. Mr. Chair, as I'm looking at the bill, and it's taken me a little while to sort my way through this, but as I understand from Representative Fenton, the goal here is to make sure that everybody who is eligible to receive SNAP benefits is able to, and we can continue doing that. And I see Representative Fenton nodding her head. As I read the bill, and I guess I'd love to get Ms. Sommerfeld's comment on this and Representative Fenton's, paragraph A talks about the federal standard and making sure we're meeting the federal standard. Fair enough. But paragraph B looks like it creates a new state standard that would require, on top of the federal standard, that we'd have to make sure that the deed commissioner verifies that the labor market conditions make the work requirements untenable, regardless of what federal law has to say about that. So we'd have to, anybody right now is in one of those counties that currently is receiving a waiver, their county would have to satisfy federal law as it does now, plus would have to satisfy this new provision being added by Representative Fenton, this additional requirement. Am I reading that correctly? Maybe I'll ask Ms. Sommerfeld first. That seems right to her.
Ms. Sommerfeld.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Representative Pinto, I think the department does not completely understand what the term untenable means. So that is something we would have to work with Representative Fenton to understand. I think we've taken this to mean that the Department of Economic Assistance would be verifying that our applications follow federal law within the counties and the tribes as we do them now. If this bill is intended to change the economic regions that we look at from counties and tribes to broader regions, then we would certainly have to work with Representative Fenton to find out exactly what region means. And so that might be something that we could work on with Representative Fenton over time to clarify in the bill.
And I should let Representative Fenton, Mr. Chair, respond to that concern that the bill kind of creates on top of the federal requirement. It seems like what I see is an additional state requirement on top of that. And Representative Fenton, am I reading that correctly as far as you see?
Thank you. It is a step to just make sure that the Commissioner of Deed is working with the Health and Human Services.
And so, Mr. Chair, I guess finally I'll just point out that is not currently, there's not currently a formal requirement that there be not only working together, I mean, presumably they have to collaborate to figure out the employment data, but they actually be this formal verification of whether the work requirements are untenable, whatever that means. And it seems to me that there's no way that could cause more people to be getting benefits and for food and SNAP. If anything, it would stay the same or would cause fewer people to receive those benefits and more of the people to have to be supported by the food shelves, which we have heard directly from the people doing it that are really already stretched. So I oppose the bill as constructed. It seems to me that we are fully in compliance from everything that's been said, and I haven't heard anything to the contrary. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Pinto. Representative Considine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Webster? So this is the area that you deal with. You're somewhat of an expert in this area.
Mr. Chair, Representative Considine, yes, I am a nerd in this area.
So when you're telling us that you don't understand the bill and that you have concerns with it because you don't understand it, we can pretty much assume that other people across the state and DHS would also have trouble understanding it? Would that be a reasonable assumption?
Mr. Chair, Representative, that's reasonable, and it's not because I haven't attempted to understand it. I've talked with DHS. I've also asked if there's anything else nationally. Is there a place that this has shown up? And the other national experts on SNAP haven't seen this standard or this phrasing before. So it's not something any of us really know what the implications would be.
Representative Considine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Fenton, that's kind of scary. If somebody that is an expert and deals with it all the time is telling us she doesn't understand it and that it's confusing, then, and we've lost 67,000 people already off the food program, that gives me great pause. I see from the stuff that she's handed out that Blue Earth County, where I'm from, has lost 321 people. My wife sits on the board of the Echo Food Shelf in Mankato. I'm proud to say my father started 30 years ago. And I get to go to their events every so often, and each year I hear that they are serving more and more people, and that it is getting tougher and tougher for them to meet the demand. And that also scares me a little bit, because they are working as hard as they can to try to meet the demand, and each year the number goes up. I think it was last year they were doing about 75 families a day, and this year it was up to about 100 families a day. And that's a real problem. And if we are now going into uncharted territory where an expert cannot decipher the bill, then I'm afraid I cannot support that unless we can make some sort of adjustments prior to it going forward. And I guess I'd like to see the bill laid over or tabled until we can have some assurances that we aren't going to make things worse. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Considine. Representative Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm grateful for the testimony from the Department of Human Services, and it reminds me, right, once a bill becomes a law, that we can't go back to the author for interpretation. And if we were to pass this now and this were to become law right now, we would be creating what feels to me like an undefined level of bureaucracy that could really get in the way of serving the people who are hungry. And I'm sure that's not your intention, Representative Fenton. And if I were in your shoes, I would be deleting paragraph B altogether, because it's confusing, and I can't hear from either the testifiers or from you why it needs to be included in here. But and I think Representative Considine offers you a nice pathway, an elegant pathway to, lay it on the table so you can consider what that means. But if the bill actually moves to another committee, I hope that before we see this again on the floor, that this section is deleted or cleaned up so its intention is clear, because we're going to have a heck of a debate on the floor of the House if it looks like this, because I don't understand what it is, and nobody can clarify for us what this means, and I think it puts people in harm's way, and I can't believe that's what you want. But if that's where we're headed with the leadership of the House, then we're going to have a day of debate over one simple paragraph that needs to get cleaned up.
All right, thank you, Representative Murphy. And with that, we are at the end of the questions for members? Is there any members of the public that would like to testify on House File 3612? Seeing none, Representative Fenton, final word.
Thank you. And my intent is not to rewrite or violate federal law. I just want to make sure that we do enforce it. And as this bill moves on, I will be happy to work with everybody to make sure that there's a clear understanding and change things as we have to. But I do believe that it's important for our Commissioner of Deed and our DHS to work together on this issue so that we can preserve this program for those who really need it. So that is my only intent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd request a roll call.
Roll call having been requested, there will be a roll call, and the clerk will take the roll.
Chair Dean.
Aye.
Representative Albright. Representative Murphy.
No.
Representative Allen.
No.
Representative Backer.
Aye.
Representative Considine.
No.
Representative Fisher. Representative Franson.
Aye.
Representative Gruenhagen.
Aye.
Representative Haley.
Aye.
Representative Halverson.
No.
Representative Hamilton.
Yes.
Representative Heinzman.
Aye.
Representative Johnson.
Aye.
Representative Liebling.
No.
Representative Loeffler.
No.
Representative Lomer.
Yes.
Representative Lunan.
Yes.
Representative Pearson.
Aye.
Representative Pinto.
No.
Representative Schumacher.
Aye.
Representative Schultz.
No.
Representative Zerwas.
Aye. There being 13 ayes and 8 nays, the motion prevails, and House File 3612 is re-referred to the Committee on Ways and Means. Thank you, Representative.